Welcome to Identity Unboxed, where we provide mentorship and promote representation for Black professionals in the advancement of the Black community.
We are seeking guidance from exceptional Black leaders, scholars, and professionals with expertise in their respective fields.
We hope to foster a space that promotes authenticity, inclusivity, and restoration for our listeners while exploring the intersection of our personal and professional lives.
This project is a culmination of our lived experiences as young Black professionals to transform our life trajectories, to overcome adversity and reach triumph.
Our intention is to inspire you on your path to discovering your purpose.
All right. Well, hello, Dr. Blanford. Thank you so much for joining us today on Season 2 of Identity Unboxed. We're super happy to have you. And thank you so much, first and foremost, for all the work you've done in the community to help youth and students. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Of course. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll get started on our first question. For decades, you've had an extensive career in public service, from being a legislative analyst in the early 1990s to being the current executive director at the Seattle Children's Alliance. Can you take us back to the moment when you decided to pursue a career in public service and what has motivated you to craft your career in this space?
Sure. I, way back when I was in college, had a real desire to have an impact. I'm old enough to not remember Martin Luther King, but hear stories about King and the work that he did to uplift his community, his demographic, and I felt inspired to try to do similar work. Not going to be King, obviously, but have a great desire to have an impact in my community, in particular because I come from people who were mired in generational poverty, and because I had some lucky breaks and my parents really invested in my education, I felt a strong desire to try to give back and make sure that similarly situated kids had the same opportunities that I did.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. And could you describe those early moments in your career when you decided to pursue a career in public service and kind of what that was like for you? Any challenges that you encountered early on? Did you ever waver in what you wanted to go for? So if you will be willing to share that.
Yeah, one of the first times that I actually thought about public service was I got an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. with the Close-Up program in high school. And I got a chance to see legislators, Congress people, and go to Washington, D.C. and saw myself following in those footsteps in some way. And so pursued a political science degree because I wanted to understand how politics worked. And then moved to Washington State to go to law school and ended up meeting a woman who was working in nonprofit work at the time and was so inspired by that work that I shifted my career into that field. And confluence of events where my educational background kind of aligned with my professional work, and it accelerated in a really nice way. So eventually I started doing nonprofit work and pretty quickly became an executive director, and then have pursued that work for the last 25 years now. And as far as wavering, there were lots of times where I really struggled with wanting to go back to school, primarily because I felt like I was making the right decisions, but I didn't know why. And going back to school, understanding some of the theoretical constructs, getting information and coaching on the things that I did not know very well, which was really important. Frequently, you go to the things that you're good at, but having an all-encompassing job of running an organization requires sometimes that you do the things that you don't like to do or that you aren't very good at. And so over time became much more well-balanced. And I think that serves me well in my current role as executive director of Children's Alliance.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I know we went to the same grad school, so shout out to the Evans School fellow
Indeed.
graduate. Yeah. I was hoping you could touch on a little bit more how your identity, because I know you brought it up briefly, but how your upbringing and how your identity also influenced this decision just as a Black man growing up in the era that you did.
Yeah, without a doubt, my demographic, me as a Black man in America, and I think a very conscious Black man in that I spent a lot of time studying the works of Martin Luther King and James Baldwin and even W.E.B. Du Bois. So had a real conscious a recognition that we as a people have been oppressed and that there's a responsibility for those of us who have been fortunate enough to be put in a position to be a catalyst for the uplift of our people. It's something that's really key to me. I get a lot of feedback and positive input. And if I can share just a really brief story, my personal hero is my uncle, Clifford C. Sims, who in the Vietnam War, he ended up winning the Congressional Medal of Honor because he was leading a bunch of troops and a grenade was thrown into their bunker, and without thinking about it, he threw his body on that grenade, and he blew himself up, but he saved a huge number of people. And when I was in Washington, D.C. last week, I went to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I also went to the African American Museum, and there's an exhibit that is specific to him as someone that won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And I think about his experience. I think a lot about what he did and what he thought about in that moment. And it inspires me in those days where I have my own personal doubts to just kind of lean in and be fearless and go be unapologetic about the things that I care about. And I think that has served me well over these many years.
That is so powerful. And I've heard the Northwest African American Museum is so impactful. I would love to visit. I haven't had the chance yet. I was hoping if you would share a bit about the importance of understanding our shared history and how that impacted your decision making when it came to your professional trajectory. You mentioned very prominent civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin. And can you talk about that in the context of our current landscape of education right now, where it seems that our history is not being shared fully when it comes to the perspectives of marginalized individuals, particularly those in the Black community? So if you would be willing, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, it's serendipitous that we're having this conversation today because last week when I was at the African American Museum in DC, if you haven't been there, you go into the basement of the building, which is they have several stories below grade. And you basically are in a slave ship, the equivalent replica of a slave ship, and you get to experience what it meant to be an African in the Middle Passage to America. And they very intentionally force lots of people to be in a very tight space where you're kind of cramped and it's dark and it's very scary. And you can just imagine the horror that my descendants had to go through, your descendants had to go through in order to come to America. And, you know, as you move up the levels of the museum, you go through the Civil War and then the period after the Civil War where there's the Emancipation Proclamation, but we're still living, very oppressed lives. And those are lives that my family is very close to in that my grandfather, descendant of slaves, not very far away from slavery, and would tell us stories of stories that he heard, and all along would teach us what our responsibility was to try to advance our people to a place where we could be authentic citizens of the United States. And one of the things that is very troubling to me these days is how our history is being whitewashed. I'm sure we will get to my school board service, but I was very troubled by the fact that when I was the school board director and we were buying textbooks for Seattle Public Schools, and there was whitewashing that was occurring then, and those were the progressive textbooks. There were textbooks that really whitewashed our history. And so regardless of whether it is textbooks, I think there's some responsibility that we have to our children to make sure that that history is shared. It is an uncomfortable history, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be grappled with. And the manifestations of it continue to occur, particularly as we follow these tendencies to try to whitewash it and make it as though it didn't happen.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I do want to just go briefly back and touch on the story that you shared about your uncle. Thank you for sharing that. And, I'm sorry that happened. And unfortunately, it's sad because I feel like the story of the Black experience often is sacrifice, and I think it speaks to that, how, a lot of the times, in order to help the collective and the highest good, it takes sacrifice. And we've seen that even with leaders like you mentioned, like Dr. Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, who were fighting for change, and, that cost their lives. And so like you said, it's easy to remember, when we get down on ourselves, we got to reflect on those that came before us to keep this good fight going. And I also want to touch on what you just said relating to Black history. I recently had a conversation with my aunt who grew up in the South, and, she was telling me how, back in the day when she was in, middle school, she asked her teacher, why don't we talk about Black history? And the teacher said, well, if you haven't done anything, and kind of shrug their shoulders. And so I think that goes, furthers the point that our history has been whitewashed, and hopefully, through leadership and people like you in public service, we can continue to, fight that cause and push back against those who are actively trying to make sure that we don't learn our true history today.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And it's so unfortunate that that it's easier for us to whitewash history than to just grapple with it. Regardless of where you fall out on reparations, there is a history that is very contrary to what the Constitution tells us, that all men are created equal. Well, some men weren't created equal according to the Constitution, and the inconsistency, the dissonance that is caused when our values don't align with our actions. I think we have to grapple with that and become the more perfect union that we aspire to be.
Most definitely. And I think you speak to the importance of representation when it comes to your work pursuing educational equity. And when you are confronting white supremacy culture, it's important to have diverse voices at the table that can really center our perspectives. And in November 2013, you were elected as the school board director representing the International District, Capitol Hill, Downtown, and Central District neighborhoods in Seattle with 88% of the vote. Can you take us back to this journey and share what this experience taught you both emotionally and professionally?
Yeah, so I had worked in Seattle Public Schools for a while and was a student of Seattle Public Schools. So my master's degree and my doctoral work was in education policy. And so in 2011, I was one of 3 Black men to earn a doctorate in the University of Washington system. So that's all of the campuses at the University of Washington. There were only 3 of us. And in the following year, there were zero. And the year following that, there were zero Black men. And so I knew that it was a rare thing that I had achieved and felt a huge amount of responsibility. Shortly thereafter, there were a number of people that came to me and said, Stephan, put your money where your mouth is. There's an open seat and you should give it some serious consideration. And a few years before, I had gone to the first Obama inauguration, had taken my family to the Obama inauguration, and we were out in the cold with a whole lot of other Black folks, and it was just a wonderful experience. What came away from me, what I came away with, was that I really needed to step up. And so the opportunity presented itself. I felt a strong desire to put my name in the hat and see how it would play out. I was amazed that I got 88% of the vote, which was set the record since they were keeping records for the largest margin of victory in a Seattle Public Schools school board race, in an uncontested race, or in a contested race where there were two people running. And so I felt a strong desire to take what I had learned, which was how to close opportunity gaps between different groups of students. That was the primary focus of my doctoral work. And so it was a great experience. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And but it's the thing that I'm probably most proud of, other than my child.
That's amazing. Can you share more about, I could just imagine running for office is just scary in general, in any respect. Can you take us through that emotional journey and what you felt inside as you were going through that experience?
Yeah, it was all of those things and many, many more. You realize on the day that you file, that you put your name, you go through all this paperwork and submit some money in order to actually file. And then you realize, wow, this is kind of like a popularity contest, and I don't know if I'm very popular. But I started to reach out to friends that I knew, in particular, people who their name meant something, or their title or the work that they had done historically meant something. And I talked to them, and over and over again, people would say, Stephan, I'm down. Sign me up for the campaign. I will endorse. I'll write you a check, whatever you need me to do. And there became kind of a momentum that came from that. And one of the great things about it was we run in the neighborhoods that you mentioned, Tiana, in the primary, but in the general, you run citywide. And so I got a chance to talk to people in all parts of the city that I normally don't actually go to very often, the northwest corner of the city or the northeast corner of the city. And as I got a chance to go to endorsement meetings and meet with people, sometimes in their homes, and talk about kids and schools and their experience, I got much more confident, because I could speak to the things that I knew, that I cared very deeply about, and that I could be really unapologetic about what I believed was the most important thing that Seattle Public Schools needed to do, which was to close its very large opportunity gaps. It has, continues to have, one of the largest opportunity gaps of any urban school system in the nation. And given the fact that there's so many people that care passionately about education in Seattle, I would go to them and say, it is unacceptable. That is the thing that I want to address first. And, whether I'm talking to white parents, parents of color, I saw a lot of people say, yes, I agree. And even if it means that my kid gets a little bit less to make sure that other kids have the opportunity to actually find success. A lot of people were down for that. And so when the actual race happened, when, we had to, when the votes happened and the voters pamphlet went out, even though I had foot-long dreadlocks at the time, I managed to get 88% of the vote. And then it got hard. Then it got really hard. The campaigning was much easier than actually running the district.
That is so inspiring. And I'm sure having all of those people step up to support you kind of bolstered your confidence about your capabilities. And just addressing also, you talked about an important point with the opportunity gap. And that is something that's very prevalent in Seattle, as you mentioned, with the wealth inequality here. And just to see those disparities and to have someone like you at the table is so important when you're paving the way and you're one of the only to do it. And could you talk about any like mentors in your life? Were there someone that or people that you look towards that helped you kind of guide that journey to running for that office, or were you kind of just figuring it out as you went?
Yeah, I had a really strong mentor. Obviously, my uncle serves as kind of an icon, someone to aspire to have his bravery and his commitment to the people that he was working with. But I have a mentor who passed away sadly shortly before I ran. And one day before I was actually involved in nonprofits or education, I worked for what is now Kaiser Permanente, back then was Group Health Cooperative. And there was this fairly elderly man who was at the end of his career. And I had read a study that said that we as Black people need to find mentors, particularly if we work in large corporations or organizations. We need to find mentors because many of us don't have, our parents don't have experience in large bureaucracies and don't know how to help to steer us through the complexities of those. And my parents definitely weren't that. And so I saw this guy and I was scared to ask him to serve as a mentor for me. So I asked him if there was someone that he knew that could be a mentor. And he responded back and said, Stephan, I'd like to be your mentor. And as a result of that partnership, which lasted for formally for probably 4 or 5 years, but informally lasted much, much longer, he put me on a path towards public service. He introduced me to a lot of people that have become friends and allies in my work. And he had the confidence in me that I might not have had in myself back in the day. And so any chance I get to talk to people about mentorship, I encourage them to do that, either to search out a mentor, or if they're capable to be a mentor towards someone that's younger and shows promise. I even ended up becoming a big brother, so I could find a kid and spend some time with them and do some mentoring as a way to pay it forward. And so I'm glad you asked that question because mentorship is key to me. It's something that's very, very important.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And that's part of the reason why we started this podcast. Like you said, a lot of Black people growing up, we don't have that mentorship or representation. And so it's kind of hard to navigate bureaucracy and these settings in the workplace. And that's something that I struggled with when I first entered the workplace. It was like, whoa, take a step back. And that's when I realized, once I got out of school, I had so much to learn just about like navigating the real world, especially cultivating those professional relationships. And so it's really amazing that people like you come onto this podcast and are able to share their stories as well, and help mentor us and the listeners in a way. And so moving on to our next question, for over 16 years, you were the principal and co-owner of Lighthouse Consulting, which provides equity-based research and evaluation to school districts and nonprofits. What advice can you share for young professionals with the goal of starting their own consulting firm?
Great question. I highly encourage people to figure out ways to start their own businesses whenever possible. Because, my experience of going through a number of different organizations and getting more than my fair share of rejection letters, turn downs, not getting hired for something that I knew I was qualified for, and in some cases that I was the most qualified person for. We talk a good game about racism being over, but people of color know that that's not the case, and there's lots of subtle ways of turning us down from those opportunities. So in some cases, we have to just start our own thing. And in my case, it came as a result of my research. So when I finished my doctorate and was writing my dissertation, I wrote it at a school district. And at the end of the time, when I finished the dissertation, the administrators of that school district said, "You know a whole lot, and we want you to actually come back and work with our administrators to close our opportunity gaps. You have more knowledge about that issue than anybody that works in our organization." So they encouraged me to start a business, consulting business. And I discovered really quickly that they weren't the only school district that was in need of my service. And so very quickly, I had a list of clients that started with school districts and eventually became cities. Anyone that's grappling with disparities in outcomes for their citizens was interested in the techniques and strategies that Lighthouse Consulting came up with. And so that allowed me to be a school board director because I didn't have to have a full-time job and could spend my time actually refining my practice and bringing what I'd learned in my school board service back to Lighthouse Consulting. And so it became a virtuous cycle that I still enjoy doing, but decided I wanted to go back into nonprofit work. And so that brings me to Children's Alliance.
That's so fantastic. And you touched on a very important point about how these institutions were not created with us in mind. So often they do not recognize our value or acknowledge our past accomplishments, even when you are one of the most qualified candidates for a role. So for you to be able to embark on that journey to create your own business and start that venture, that's just amazing. And I think so inspiring for people listening in. And I was hoping you would talk about your leadership challenges a bit more, particularly as you've been in public service for decades. What challenges have you faced in leadership, and how have you made your authenticity with the pressures of working in public-facing roles? I know you talked about how you had your natural dreads when you were running for school board, school board director, which is that's courageous, and it's unfortunate that as, Black people that we can't feel comfortable a lot of times showing up in these spaces as ourselves. But I think what you were able to do to show up authentically is, just something that allows people to feel that they can also do the same. So yeah, would you be able to share a bit about that?
Yeah, the dread experiment was very much an experiment. It was partially I wanted to see what the response that progressive Seattle would have to a Black man with dreadlocks running for an important position like a school board seat. And I actually did a Google search because I wanted to see if it came up, and maybe I just missed. So I just Googled dreadlocks Stephan Blanford, and there was no mention, not once. And I think in many parts of the country, that would be a different conclusion. And in progressive Seattle, and I use that term very loosely because I call it passive progressive Seattle, where we are very reluctant to say anything that is off-putting, but those feelings still exist. And so I think it was an interesting experience um, to make laws and rules and do all kinds of things with a full head of dreadlocked hair back in the day. But I think as you said before, I got to be my authentic self in that role, and I took it very, very seriously. And I think that there's something to be learned from that. I'm still studying. I'm very glad that I'm not a school board director anymore. They're doing the hardest work that any school board will have to do, which is to close schools. But we have to figure out how to be authentically ourselves and still operate inside of organizations that sometimes are hostile to that concept of us being our authentic selves. And so that requires a lot of sophistication and nuance. And we have to sometimes be willing to leave those organizations and take steps to make sure that people know that their kind of backwards ways of thinking about things need to change. And so, it's easy for me to say, but sometimes it is important for people to understand what they're willing to put up with, what they're willing to compromise on, and what they're not willing to compromise on. And that allows you to go into those types of environments with a level of authenticity and an unapologetic nature that eventually you'll get where you need to be. Mine is a classic study of someone who arrived in Seattle with not very much money and just the stuff that was in my car. And somehow I've been able to make a life for myself.
That's amazing. And I love that you called it passive progressive Seattle, because that's something that I definitely witnessed. And I'm sure a lot of young Black professionals have witnessed being in this state. And I bring this up because I really want to seek your advice, because that's the main thing that I bumped into when I first started my professional journey outside of academia. Seattle is so progressive. They have all the Black people on the pamphlets. Everyone has a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard. All the businesses and nonprofits are for the people, Black Lives Matter. And then I got into these organizations and I was like, wait, this isn't actually being done. That's not actually being done. What are we doing to actually get out in these communities in an intentional way, other than, for the look of it, to look progressive? And in these spaces where I tried to start to implement things or bring forth suggestions that would actually shift things in a creative way or kind of lead towards that systemic change internally, I noticed that I would get beat down. And that's what really woke me up to, whoa, just because, people are progressive on the outside doesn't mean that they actually want to change these systems in place that are geared to benefiting white people. And so I want to ask for your advice, and because our generation, Gen Z, I feel like we're kind of bullheaded. We know what we want. We want to make that change. And so we just go for it. And sometimes when you go about that in certain ways, it can be self-sabotaging because then you're out of a job and then you can't make the actual change. So what advice do you have for young professionals that are really eager to make this change as they enter the workforce and are having struggles navigating how to go about making that change in a way that also protects their livelihood?
Yeah, I think there's some elements of pragmatism. Young people in particular have to realize that things are not going to move as fast as they want them to. I can remember when I came out of my undergrad and was like, the world needs to change. It needs to change tomorrow, and I'm going to be part of that change, right? And you get a few turn downs, and you're in a couple of environments where it's performative. It's not really making the type of progress that we want to have made. And then you realize that that the real work is to be persistent, to stay in the fight, to be unapologetic, and to figure out where you need to be, what the platform is where you can make the biggest difference. I encounter a lot of young people now that I have to coach around the pace of change. And there's part of me that hurts as I'm coaching them around that, around slowing down, recognizing that you've got a lot of things that you have to learn in order to actually affect the change that you want to see happen in the world. And, you know, maybe that makes me an old fuddy-duddy. And I definitely don't want to be that person. I feel like all of my life I've wanted to see change happen. But I've come to the recognition that they need to be fearless, and they need to push me and my generation to move faster than we might have liked. And, you know, when I think about MLK and his letters from Birmingham jail, one of his most famous writings, he talked about the pace of change. And in that particular case, he was talking to what he called white moderates and saying, you know, when you're telling us that we need to slow down, right? You're on the wrong side of history. And he paid for that with his life. And so there's a cautionary tale there. But we live in a very progressive place, but it is a very performatively progressive place. And we, as people of color, Black folks in particular, we have to recognize the environment that we exist in and continually push, be agents of change, but also recognize that change happens not as fast as we might like it to.
Yeah, that reminds me of a phrase I learned at the Evans School in one of my early classes in my first year, tempered radicalism, which is short for the slow and steady win the race.
Yes.
Understanding that, you know, those in the majority do have the power, and that, you know, it takes time to bring that change. And so how you go about bringing that radical change sometimes has to be drawn back so that you aren't too aggressive about it, and then creating more friction with those who have the most influence in these systems, because then it might cause stagnancy when you're trying to create change. And like you said, with the older generations, that's something that I think Gen Z struggles with, because now we're, you know, facing the climate crisis and things of that nature. And we kind of like, we're running out of time. Like, we don't have time to wait and sit around for this change anymore. So.
Right. But I would say to you that my big learning from the Evans School was that you can want that change to happen. The responsibility that you as a leader has is to analyze the environment and figure out where are the levers for change. There are so many people that I have encountered that are bluntly attacking the system without any analysis of the levers of change in that system. You can actually affect change. I believe you can. But if it's just a blunt attack rather than a surgical approach, I think you'll just spin your wheels and burn off a lot of energy without accomplishing anything. And so I encourage people all the time to spend some time actually analyzing the environment, knowing who the players are, knowing what their interests are, and figuring out how can you leverage that to get the outcome that you want. You're much more likely to achieve success. And I think that definitely is a strategy that we use at Children's Alliance to try to understand how to get policies passed for children all across the state of Washington.
I think you also touched on a really important point about intergenerational knowledge and how when we collaborate, we're able to understand how to pursue those long-term visions. And, with Gen Z, we're so audacious and we want to see those instantaneous type of changes that you mentioned, but it's important to remind ourselves that progress is incremental and that each small step towards a better future that we want to see is still progress. So I just wanted to point that out, and also that critical reading, Letters from Birmingham Jail, so important. Many people need to read that. It's something that still resonates with me. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good transition into our next question. Following the tragic school shooting at Garfield High School, you wrote an op-ed in the South Seattle Emerald calling for more action in the Washington State Legislature to address gun violence. In particular, you touched on the intersection of mental health and gun violence. And we want to know if you can speak to the importance of addressing mental health and generational trauma as it relates to the gun violence epidemic.
Well, I did draw the connection between those two things. We at Children's Alliance have been working a lot on the issue of teen mental, emotional, and behavioral health because Washington State is way behind most other states in terms of kids reporting incidences of anxiety and depression. Our numbers are way, way higher than most other states. And so that's something that we're trying to draw attention to in the state legislature and get laws passed that and programs started that will start to address that crisis. Frequently, when you hear of a school shooting or something like that, there is some undiagnosed behavioral health issue, and we're just trying to get ahead of that. I know because I talked to many administrators, school administrators, and they tell me that the biggest crisis that they're facing right now has to do with kids and behavioral health. As a result of the pandemic, kids being locked in for as long as they were, schools are much more chaotic than they have been in years. And I'm talking veteran administrators that I've known for a long time, for decades, that are leaving the system because they can't deal with the chaos that they're seeing in schools. And because there are, so many guns in our society. In that op-ed, I talked about the fact that there's 4.6 million homes with a child in the home that also there's a gun in the home that is unlocked and loaded. So just imagine, the carnage that can come from kids bringing a gun to school, as happened at Garfield High School, just a few blocks away from where I live. We have to get ahead of that. And there are ways to do it. We always, in the United States, we're always an outlier when it comes to gun violence. Most countries in the world don't have anywhere close to the amount of gun violence that we do. And as you see from the, from the court rulings that are happening now, there's more unfettered access to lethal weapons. Pull the trigger, fire 50 bullets, not one bullet. That we have to get on top of this. And there are people who didn't want me to write that op-ed, but if we're about children and my organization is about children, someone has to say something, and I was happy to say something about it.
You point to something that I think is so important for us to talk about, which is that we need more stringent policies surrounding guns, and people do have the unfettered access. And I think it's a larger question of why as a society are we allowing our children to be put in environments where they are in danger? And, why are we not asking for a call to action from our elected leaders to make those changes that we need to see? And I was hoping you would share, if you could implement one policy change to have safer gun laws and to prevent gun violence, what would that be? I know that's
You
a
know,
large question, but
when I think about the Second Amendment and, a well-regulated militia, even the founders in the 1700s could not have imagined guns with the type of lethality that we're talking about now. Um, Assault weapons only to be used in war, created only to be used in war. You can't go into a store without wondering if someone's carrying something. And even the founders, misguided as they may have been, could not have imagined what we're dealing with these days. So I would have a radical rethink of what the Second Amendment actually says and does. We, as I shared before, we're an outlier compared to the rest of the world in terms of the amount of violence that is visited on men, women, and children. And there's no reason for it. No one's coming to attack the United States. Their need for a well-regulated militia. We have one of the largest armies in the world. I don't think we need to point weapons at our own citizens.
Absolutely. I really agree with the point that you made, that our founding fathers probably did not anticipate that we would be giving assault weapons to our citizens and that folks would be roaming free with these weapons. And I think part of the issue is that we have so many guns out there that, just from perspective of a regular person, if you're living in a neighborhood that's dangerous and riddled with gun violence, you might buy a gun for your home because you wake up to gunshots at night, or maybe you lost a family member to gun violence and you feel unsafe in your community, in addition to police violence that we see, and then violence within your own community. And then you go out and stock up on guns because you don't feel safe. And I think that's a large issue in our country, is that a lot of people just do not feel safe because of the amount of guns that are out there. So then what do, some people do is they go buy guns themselves because they're living in a state of fear.
Right.
And then that just continues to replicate.
Yeah. But the statistic that is scary when you think about that is someone in their family is most likely to be a victim of gun violence because they have a gun in their home, right? Suicide rate increases a whole lot by the fact that there is a gun in the home. And, a shooting where someone that is loved in the family because of an argument or something like that, because there's a gun in the home. It's a vicious spiral that we have to interrupt somehow. And I'm not quite sure how to do it, given the fact that the Second Amendment, some believe that it gives them unfettered access to any weapon that they want.
thank you for sharing that fact. I did not know that, so that's really great to hear and to continue to bring awareness to the issue. Pivoting a bit, we would like to talk a bit more about funding in public schools, which comes from state and local governments. Regarding local governments, roughly 81% of this funding comes from property taxes, according to recent data from USA Facts, a not-for-profit, nonpartisan civic initiative making government data easy for all Americans to access and understand. This creates disparate harm in socioeconomically disadvantaged neighborhoods. From your experience, can you discuss equitable policy solutions to address this issue and the importance of representation within these policy decisions, which I know you have already covered, but if there is anything else you'd like to add to that, please feel free.
Yeah, the fact that schools are funded based on property tax is just inherently racist, because communities of color have less wealth, have less home ownership. Their homes are worth less. And as a result of that, their schools are underfunded. And as a result of that, opportunity gaps just get bigger, not smaller. And it's so troubling, particularly when you think about, I was in DC earlier last month, and for the 75th anniversary of Brown versus Board, 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education, which when I went to school, there were teachers that were talking about that being the most consequential Supreme Court ruling in the history of the Supreme Court of the United States, because it said that separate is inherently unequal, and it undid this practice of putting Black kids and white kids in separate schools, which there was no way that they were going to be funded equally. And so you would see schools, school district that my mom attended, for example, that she could go to school from kindergarten through 10th grade. There was no school for 11th, 12th grade. And so, and that was just a function of the way that it operated in the South. And so, you know, I think we are making progress, but as the statistics have come out, we live in more segregated neighborhoods now, and we send our kids to more segregated schools than there were back in 1954 when the ruling came about. And I know from my education policy research that when you have large numbers of kids of color in a school, it's almost guaranteed that that school is lower performing, because they bring with them their poverty. It's not their fault that their families have less wealth, but the implication of that, the ramification of that, is that we continue to see these disparities, and they just get bigger and more profound over years and generations. And so we have to figure out some strategy that is going to equalize funding. We have some in Washington State where low property tax districts get money from the state in an equalization formula, so they have additional money, but it's not sufficient. In Seattle Public Schools, they have a weighted student formula that basically takes children that are harder to educate, not because of the color of their skin, but because they come from poverty or they are special ed or whatever, and there's additional money that comes with them to the school that they're enrolled in. That's starting to address some of the disparities that we're seeing, but it doesn't get there. And in particular, it doesn't get there when there is supplemental funding that comes from parents through fundraising for a particular school that ends up exacerbating the disparities that already exist. And so there's lots of work still to be done. We can look to Portland, just down I-5, and see that they have an equalization formula for fundraising, where for every $10 that's given to an individual school, 60% of that funding will go to low-income schools. 40% will stay with the school that the original gift was given, as a way to bring the fundraising disparities into balance. That's something that we're starting to see some evidence of in Seattle, but not at scale. And until it's done at scale, we'll continue to see these huge funding disparities that have huge impacts on children.
Thank you so much for that. I think you did a really good job of speaking to how the fact that schools are funded through property taxes is inherently racist. I think when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, a lot of people who are in opposition to it feel that we should live in a merit-based society. But what people don't realize is that people don't have the equal opportunity to get that type of education. You know, you go to, a poor, impoverished neighborhood, they don't have the same curriculum. They don't have, as good as teachers, because teachers end up leaving to other school districts that have more funding to get paid better, that have more resources, better textbooks. It reminds me of a study that I read about in school. I believe it's the Moving to Opportunity experiment, where They provided housing vouchers for folks in low-income communities to move to higher income communities to see what the academic outcomes would be for those students when they relocated. And of course, their academic success was more, their career trajectories were more when they moved or relocated to those cities. And I think that's what people fail to realize, is that because of redlining, because of systemic racism, the majority of America's neighborhoods are still racially concentrated. And so you think about, race and people, combating that because they believe in merit. I think what they're not taking into consideration is that these long-term, policies and laws that were created to essentially oppress Black and brown people have not been reversed. And so therefore, we don't have the same opportunity to thrive and excel in the way that those in the majority do.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And, those progressives in Seattle and in other places, many of them benefit from the system staying the way that it is. And so that's where the passive progressive comes from. It's like, it's performative to say, I'm down for all of these changes, but if you're not actually following through and recognizing that you benefit and that there's a cost that you personally need to pay as a result of that privilege, then nothing changes. Nothing changes.
Yes. And, it's important for those in power to understand that they must relinquish some of that privilege in order to redirect that to those in need. And you spoke about those equalizer formulas, and that's so fantastic about Portland, that they've been able to institute that into policy, because as we can see throughout history, our community has been economically disenfranchised. I believe, we are owed like trillions. I don't know the exact number, but I read it in the 1619 Project, which I'm sure you've read, Stephan, but it's fantastic. And just talks about how, these systems have continued to keep us within, poverty and unable to access those opportunities that we need to advance. And it's that difference between equality and equity. And when it comes to equity, it means providing those that are most in need those resources to get to that next level. So we can't have a meritocracy if everyone doesn't have a fair chance. So I just thank you, for bringing that point up. And I hope that in Seattle, we can keep moving towards equity and, understanding that some people need a little bit more to thrive, but if they are given those resources, they will be successful. Thank you.
One other thing that I would add very quickly is reflecting on my experience being at the African American Museum in DC earlier last week. On the fourth floor of that building is a celebration of all the cultural contributions that Black people have made to society in the United States and around the world. And if you haven't seen it, you should see it, because it is, you can't come away from that museum without knowing the incredible journey that we have had from the basement of the building all the way to the fourth floor. And you see leaders, you see sports stars, you see how we've affected the culture, from music to dance to art to food. And it is a celebration of Black joy that is bigger and more profound than anything that I've ever seen. And it speaks to the incredible role that we play in American society. And it's very inspiring. Very inspiring.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to visit it. And I just remember how moved I was when I was going through the different rooms and the different levels to see, where our ancestors were and how far we've come, but also how much we continue to endure. And I think that leads perfectly into our last question, just reflecting on our history and our shared experience. What does Blackness mean to you, Dr. Blanford?
Well, I could have, you could have asked me that question before I just said what I said, because in my mind, it is, it's that transition from where we were to where we are. There is a there's a saying that's up on the wall that I took a picture of because it perfectly encapsulates what my experience with Blackness is. And it is making a way out of no way. And it talks about the fact that even though we didn't have well-funded schools, that someone built a little ramshackle school, and it was full of kids learning from a teacher who probably was getting contributions from the community in order to pay her bills, because we knew that education was important. We knew that collective efforts were important. We knew that the struggle was important. We come from a history of people who were stuck in the bottom of those slave ships and still managed to create all this art and beauty and culture that leads the world, that people are appropriating all the time, right? Stealing our culture because it is something to behold. And in many cases, it comes from that experience, that unrecognized, unappreciated struggle that we've been through, that allows us to create this beauty that, to me, I leave from it every time. I've been in there probably 6 or 7 times now. I leave from it every time inspired by my Blackness and other people's Blackness and what it means and how it can manifest and how we need to continue to struggle.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so looking forward to going to the African American Museum. That will be my next trip for sure, because it's been on my bucket list. And I love that you talk about Black joy, because a lot of times in history, we've only been taught about the struggle and we don't see Blackness as something to be prideful about. But once you start to uncover our history, you see our vast contributions and how you said we've affected so many different aspects of society that people are still learning about, even within our community and outside of our community. I know for me, I wasn't really able to dive into Black history until I'd gotten to college and was able to take some classes that were really focused on our people. And I, was able to discover so many different authors and just historians and change makers and innovators. And that for me has instilled that feeling of continuing to persist and that resilience that we have as a people, to keep pushing forward change, to ensure that everyone's brought in, that we're inclusive, and everyone can, be successful. So thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really enriching conversation and a great way to kick off July. So is there anything you'd like to add or any piece of advice before we get off today?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share. And I think, just the fact that you have this opportunity for people to learn from others and is a great opportunity, a great chance for us to confer information from one place to another. So I'm looking forward to future episodes of it.
Thank you so much, Stephan. This was amazing and so uplifting to start our Monday morning. I'm just so grateful that you were able to impart your knowledge and experience with us and all of our listeners. So stay on the lookout for this episode in September. We're so excited for people to hear it. And thank you again. I hope you have a great rest of your day and fun on your trip.
All right.
Thank you.
It's good talking to you both. Take care. Bye.
All right. You as well. Bye.
Bye-bye.
We are so grateful for your support, and thank you for listening to Identity Unboxed.
Authenticity is your guide to cast an impact on the world that you will be proud of. Signing off with pride, Tiana
and Brad.
Thank you so much.